Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of the Daily Run, and today we're playing as Isaac. Isaac is one of those characters which is just inherently high variance, which means that if two people play the same run, they're gonna have vastly different experiences. Even if you go in the practice mode and play the same run again after the daily is over, I can guarantee you that your run will be somewhat different. And that just depends, maybe you explore a different path, you just go in different rooms, and maybe you don't get enough charges for a second use of your d6, which means that maybe you don't get a certain item, which then maybe breaks which items you get later on, etc, etc. Basically, there's just a lot of variables here that you have to account for if you want to have a consistent run. And because Isaac, just the binding of Isaac as a game is already, which depends a lot on the user choice and is very random, when you introduce an item like the d6, which allows you to control the randomness, so said, it does increase the variance in it, and which means that people don't really like playing as Isaac on dailies just because this is supposed to be somewhat of a competitive format, and when you kind of reduce the skill to merely luck, that's not something that really flies with a lot of people. But like I said, my stance on it is that I think that using the d6 properly does require a lot of skill as well, but at the same time I understand that on a particular run-to-run basis, it's annoying to see that someone who basically had the same run as you, but just maybe found Brimstone and you didn't find it for whatever reason, because maybe you didn't reroll a certain item that you would never think to reroll, or maybe just because you didn't visit a certain room or whatever, and I really don't like that aspect of the game, but I think overall the d6 does increase your choice, or maybe how much decisions you have to make on a particular run. But to kind of put salt on the wound, the d6 is not the only offender here. The first item we got was Rune Bag, and what Rune Bag does, it gives you a rune every third room. And runes are great, in my opinion. The addition of runes, basically runes are like cards on steroids, but much more situational. So my explanation for that is that runes in general are not just that good on their own, but when you can kind of use them in a good position. So for example, the Percher rune, you can't really do anything with the Percher rune, and even if you get an item, you maybe don't want to reroll it, but when you do have the chance to use it, maybe on 3 or 4 items, it becomes very good, and in that situation it becomes better than most of the cards that exist in the game. But just on its own, it doesn't really do anything. It's the same with Yara rune, or maybe Awa's runes, or even the Answers runes. It really depends on how you use them if you want to maximize their effectiveness, and if you use them well, they can have a lot of benefit to your run, or if you use them badly, they just can have no benefit to your run. And I do like that aspect of them. Like I said, again, I think that it does increase the skill ceiling by a little bit, just because you have to know how to use them, but on the short term, it does increase the variance of a particular run, which means that someone might have kept a Percher rune and then reroll the Devil Deal and just get a super awesome item, and someone might have stuck with an Answers room because maybe they prefer having the knowledge of where certain rooms are so they can visit them in a particular order. Of course, that also depends on just how fast you are as a player. So me, for example, I know that I'm a pretty slow player, and me having an Answers rune really helps me with my speed because I can optimize my path better. So I usually prefer to have an Answers rune over the Percher rune in most cases, especially if I'm running late on time like I was in this daily, so I decided to stick with it. But someone, like I said, might have found a Percher rune and they decided to stick with a Percher rune and maybe had an additional reroll in the Devil Deal, and they maybe have gotten a much better item than I did. And that's really no fun when you think about it, just because you're really getting penalized for preference and not really skill, because in theory, you know, you could always argue that a rune is better than the other rune. I can say, okay, Percher rune is better than the Answers rune for this reason, and I could say, oh, but Answers rune is better than the Percher rune for this reason. So it really depends on what kind of run you're dealing with. And just because you don't know what's really gonna happen on the next floor, it's hard to make that deduction on the spot. And you can really only judge if a particular rune was useful after the fact. So after you've already used it, maybe you could have said, okay, you know, maybe on this floor it would have been better if I actually stuck with the Percher rune. Regardless, there's a lot of fun things still going on here, and just because we have the D6 and the Rune Bag, which produces a lot of Percher runes for us, a lot of Algae runes, a lot of runes in general, which help us get a lot of consumables, they allow us to reroll things, we were able to actually produce a pretty strong run. We had a very good Devil Deal with 3 items. It had the Death's Touch and the Incubus, and the Incubus is one of those items that really works well because it does kind of double your damage, but not in the traditional sense that your damage is doubled, but you basically have a familiar that shoots with you. And the fact when we pick up Death's Touch, our hitbox of our tears increases so much that offset that is visible when you usually don't have an item that has such large of a sprite becomes very non-negligent, which means that every time we shoot at an enemy, we hit them with 2 tears. But if our tears were smaller, and because, like I said, Incubus is kind of lagging behind in a row of familiars, we can't really shoot twice or 2 tiers at the same enemy just because we are offset to the side from our Incubus, which means that usually one of us is hitting and one of us is missing unless there are multiple enemies in the room. But when we have an item like Death's Touch, which increases how big our tiers are, that allows us to actually hit both enemies at once, and essentially that way we do double our damage. And I've made this argument before in one of my Incubus videos, and I think Incubus is a fun item, but I think it's a bit overrated. Something like Double Shot, or 2020 is the official name, is a much better item if you want to double your damage, so-called, just because the tiers are so close together, which means that you can even hit small enemies with it. But when you have something like Incubus, if you're shooting smaller enemies, just because Incubus is offset from your position, then it becomes much harder job to actually hit those little enemies. It works well against bosses, and I'm not arguing that it's a bad item. Of course, I think it's a great item, obviously, because it does give you an additional damage source, which is based on how much damage you have and how fast you shoot and which tier effects you have, which means it's also a fun item for synergies because it kind of doubles your synergy value and whatnot. But in that situation, I would just say that maybe in some cases it's just a little bit overrated for how good it is. I'm not saying, like I said, again, it's a good item in my opinion, it's a very good item in my opinion, but it's not as good as some people might claim it might be. Another great thing that we gain with Death's Touch is obviously penetrative shots, and you really do want to have penetrative shots against Hush, because if you don't have just a ridiculous amount of damage, you'll want to get rid of enemies as fast as possible, and you can do that by basically hitting multiple amount of them. And when he starts spawning them, he spawns like 30 or 40 of them, and because they're so hard to deal with, having a way to actually deal damage to all of them at once is, I would say, almost a necessity if you want to have a good score. Or maybe not a good score, but if you don't want Hush to hit you, I think that's the main reason you want to do it. And of course, the main reason, again, why you would want to do that is because every time he spawns enemies, and if you don't kill them fast enough, he actually ducks under the earth and makes himself invincible, and he also starts shooting at you, which means that it becomes a much harder job to actually kill enemies while dodging the Hush, and he's at that point invincible, which means you can't really do anything with him. But if you just have a lot of damage, or if, like I said, if you can deal a lot of damage to a lot of enemies at once, then you can really lay it down on him, and he just comes right back up, and you can go back to shooting him. Another great combo that we got in this daily run in particular was the Lost Contact, and the Lost Contact is an item that doesn't really get a lot of recognition because usually it's not that good, and the Lost Contact, what it does is basically it gives you a shielding tiers, which means that if your tiers collide with enemy tiers, you basically destroy the enemy tiers, or in other words, your tiers also serve as a shield that block enemy tiers. So for that reason, it's an item that works well if your maybe fire rate is high enough, just because some enemies do have output a lot of tiers, which means it's very hard. If your tier rate is slow, you're basically only hitting the tiers and you're not hitting the enemy at all, which makes some bosses almost impossible to beat. Hush is one of them, just because he does spawn so many shots in tiers that if you have a slow fire rate, then it becomes a task basically that's impossible to defeat. But because we have penetrative shots, it actually allows us to traverse the enemy tiers and still hit our enemies, which means that one tier is not only serving as a damage tier, which is producing Guppy flies, because we have Guppy as well, but it's also blocking enemy shots, and against Hush, that's possibly the best combination of items you can have, penetrative shots and shielded tiers, just because he can't do anything to you. With penetrative shots, you can actually kill the enemies as he spawns them very fast, which means that he never really goes invincible, and any shots that he does, any continuum shots, you just block outright as he shoots them, which means that you're basically fighting in an empty room against an enemy that just has a bunch of HP. So when that happens, you know that you have a good daily going on, just because there are a lot of enemies which rely on shooting tiers at you, including some of the final bosses. More importantly though, I would say that you still have to be wary, even when you have this combo that, while it's a very good combo, obviously it's a very strong combo, it allows you to basically beat the enemies or a lot of bosses without being in a fear of it taking damage at all. You still have to be careful, because there are a lot of enemies which should bring some type of attacks, or maybe have explosions, and those tiers won't protect you from that, and it's very easy to fall into the mindset of, you know, I'm invincible just because I have this amazing combination which allows me to have a bunch of shielded tiers, which then of course protects me from enemy shots. But don't fall into that trap. You know, I've fallen into that trap just a bunch of times before, and it got me hit a few too many times, I would like to admit. But still, like I said, even if you do manage to get hit once or twice, it's not too big of a problem, except you lose a few points. But if you went through the same notions as I did on this run, you really shouldn't be too worried about it. So with that said, actually, this daily in particular wasn't very fun, I guess, interesting. It didn't include a lot of decisions just because of how it turned out. Just because of the D6 and the room bag, there's a lot of variety that can be had in this run, and obviously everyone is going to have a different experience, and the way I made it was probably not the most optimal way, but it turned out pretty strong because I did manage to get through it without getting hit too much. There was also a possible blank card somewhere which would allow us to break the game and get a lot of Shrek points, but I was satisfied just to get this crazy combination of items that you don't really see. We even had a mouse knife at one point, and I decided not to pick it up just because of how often maybe it comes up, and I think it's a bit of a cheap victory, and I really didn't want to lose this amazing combination that we had. Lost Contact that just doesn't come up that often. We even found Polyphemus, which is an item that I haven't seen in like 50 or 60 runs, I think. Which was also fun, and we did finish in 15th place, which again is maybe a bit inflated, maybe it seems a bit high because I'm playing this rather early, because again I have to go somewhere. But our final score was 51,000, which is not bad at all. For a Dark Room run, 51,000 points is actually a very decent score. We had a lot of exploration bonus, we didn't have a high damage penalty at all, we basically did every objective that we had. The only thing we could have improved on, I think, is getting a lot more Shrek bonus, so having a lot more consumables, and with that, of course, our score could be 60,000, and that would be just crazy amazing, but it wasn't. I was still satisfied with how it turned out, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. There was a lot of thoughts behind it, I guess, and a lot of disdain when I looked at the forums, and people didn't like it, and that's understandable, like I said, because of the high variance. But if you just enjoy the game for what it is, I think this daily is one of those runs that is just really fun to play and fun to finish. I hope you enjoyed this guy, and I hope to see you next time.